Well, hello there. So glad we get to continue our study of the miracles of Jesus as we are rapidly coming to the grand conclusion, the grand climax of Jesus' resurrection and his crucifixion and his resurrection. And so Jesus has officially entered into Jerusalem. We're officially in the final Passover week of his life. And so we got to talk yesterday about the healing of Bartimaeus and how the acclamation of Bartimaeus of Jesus as the son of David leads right into the triumphal entry where with this massive crowd of Galileans at his back, Jesus is hailed entering the city. He is riding upon the colt. He is being saluted as the son of David, the Messiah to come. And everything seems like it's going really well. But Jesus has clearly made his entrance and has clearly made his declaration known that he is claiming to be the Messiah. He is claiming to be this son of David. Today's miracle is going to tie right into that, and in fact actually takes place right after the triumphal entry. But it's a very odd miracle, and this is a miracle that I think has puzzled a lot of people, even a lot of commentators that I was reading kind of said that this is a little bit of an odd one to figure out exactly what the purpose of this is. And that's going to be the cursing of the fig tree. And I think I've said before what my favorite miracle is. This is probably one of my second favorite miracles because it does require a little bit of digging and a little bit of analysis in order to understand what's going on here. So let's take a look over here. This is recorded in two separate places for us. And so we're going to see this in both the account of Matthew and the account of Mark. Luke does not include this in his account. So we're going to take a look at Matthew first. Matthew chapter 21 and verse 18. It says, "Now in the morning, when he was returning to the city, he became hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, 'No longer shall there be any fruit from you.' And at once the fig tree withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, 'How did the fig tree wither all at once?' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. And all things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive.'" What? What? Okay, so Jesus gets hungry. Okay, normal thing. It's in the morning, maybe he didn't get a chance to eat breakfast or he was in kind of a hurry. And so he sees a fig tree. And he's like, okay, I'm going to eat some figs. It's a fairly common thing. Figs are a very common occurrence in this area. There's no figs, and so Jesus zaps the fig tree. This is such an odd miracle. Why is Jesus using his miraculous power in the first place to just, wail on an innocent tree? And more importantly, why is this important enough to be recorded by the Gospels, by two separate Gospel writers, and preserved for us through the Holy Spirit? Why is it important that Jesus is zapping this fig tree? Because what's funny is that when the apostles note this and they're like, wow, how did the fig tree wither all at once? Jesus doesn't really say why he's withered the fig tree. He doesn't really get into the purpose of withering the fig tree. He just says if you have faith and don't doubt, you could even cast a mountain into the sea. You're like, okay, so if I'm faithful enough, I can wither fig trees that don't give me figs, and I can throw mountains into the sea. What is Jesus just using hyperbolic image to make the point that faithful prayer can accomplish much? Is he making the point that if you ask certain things, God will give them to you? It's unclear about exactly what's occurring in that. And so what we need to do is we need to look a little bit more closely at the context. And I think when we look at the context, what's going to be revealed is that there's a lot more going on in this story. And so in order to understand the context first, we have to understand exactly what's occurring here and why Jesus is saying this. Now, Matthew has this account kind of condensed into one story, but if you flip over to Mark, you're going to see that Mark, I think, actually is probably telling us the more chronological telling of this. Again, we've talked about how sometimes the gospel accounts will talk in chronological ways, and sometimes the gospel accounts talk in thematic ways. And so Matthew is likely doing a little bit of a thematic approach. Mark, on the other hand, is telling us what's going to be happening chronologically. And so if you look in Mark chapter 11, what you see is that right after, again, the triumphal entry that we talked about, in Mark chapter 11 and verse 11, it says that Jesus entered Jerusalem and came into the temple. And after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. Now, this detail isn't recorded in Matthew's triumphal entry, but Jesus basically comes into the city, goes to the temple, and just kind of looks around, just sees what's going on in the temple. And then because it's late, they leave Jerusalem because they're not staying there, and they go back to Bethany, presumably to the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That's more than likely where they were staying. They were good friends with them. And so then, after they've gone to Bethany, it says in verse 12, on the next day when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Okay, so now we have a little bit more of a chronological order of what's going on. Jesus has come into Jerusalem, triumphal entry and all. He went to the temple, looked around, didn't really do anything, and then headed back to Bethany. Now, the next day, as he's coming back from Bethany, it says that he's passing by a fig tree. And it says, seeing a distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. All right, so this almost makes it weirder. Mark adds the detail, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And so now we're even more confused. So now Jesus is going up to a fig tree that is not supposed to have figs, is disappointed to not find figs, and decides to wither the tree. Like, okay, hold on, wait a second. So not only was Jesus annoyed at a tree, so much so that he withered it, he was annoyed at a tree that shouldn't have been producing figs. Now, an agriculturist could tell you that when a fig tree is producing leaves, there's actually kind of some early buds of figs that are being produced, and those actually are edible. They're not the full thing of figs, but they are a way to eat. And so you can kind of make the point that maybe Jesus is expecting those early branches. But again, this is still very odd. Why is Jesus so perturbed at this fig tree? Well, let's keep reading in Mark's account. In Matthew's account, what we're about to read takes place before the fig tree account. And so he tells this story, and then he tells the fig tree story. Mark is adding emphasis, though, by telling us the first half of the fig tree story, because notice, we didn't see if the fig tree withered yet. And now he's going to tell us a story about what happens when Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. It says, then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seat of those who were selling doves, and he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it into a robber's den. The chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. So Jesus, in the midst of this fig tree narrative, we've had the first part of it, and now Mark tells us how Jesus goes to the temple. Now remember, Mark's already told us Jesus has already seen the temple. He's already come into the temple, so he knows what's going on in the temple. So this is not Jesus being surprised by this. In fact, John has already recorded an earlier account for us in a first Passover, probably at least 2 years before this, where Jesus has similarly driven out money changers. So we know that Jesus is not surprised at this. This is not Jesus acting out of spontaneous anger. But instead, Jesus goes in, sees the situation in the temple, leaves, talks about a fig tree, and then goes to cleanse the temple. This is a very deliberate action. It's a deliberate series of actions that's going on here. Sees the temple, goes back to Bethany, comes back, curses the fig tree, drives out the money changers. And he specifically makes this commentary that they have turned the house of prayer for all nations, this temple that was the home of the glory of God, and they've turned it into a den of robbers. Now, it's important to understand for the context that Jesus is likely not mad at the actual actions that are going on, because when it's talking about the table of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves, that's actually all pretty common language there. The money changers, the money changers we actually read earlier in the gospel accounts about the poll tax. There were some people who would pay that back home. Some people would pay it when they got into Jerusalem itself. Jesus pays it early for himself and Peter. But the only coinage that was actually acceptable for the poll tax was Tyrian silver from the city of Tyre. And the reason was that it was particularly pure, and the weight of that coin was exactly the same as the shekel. And so if you had Roman currency or some form of Persian or something else like that, you would trade that currency and exchange it with the money changers for the appropriate amount of Tyrian silver. And so the money changers performed, a service to let people get the poll tax. And then these people selling doves in particular, those are sacrifices. Doves were often the sacrifices of the poor people. Now, there's contemporary evidence that more than likely these sellers of doves were probably extorting people quite a bit. They were probably charging quite a bit more than they were supposed to. But even if whether that's true or not, the problem is that all of these activities, which are, might be monetarily necessary, they're all occurring in the courtyard of the temple, likely called the courtyard of the Gentiles. And so all these monetary things, all these physical things, they're all taking place, and they're distracting from the real purpose of the temple. There are other places to spend money and to change money and to buy the sacrifices you might need. And instead, God's temple has just become this, typical marketplace of haggling and cheating and lying and all these different things. And it's this terrible thing. And even worse than that, Josephus, one of the contemporary writers of this time period, tells us that Caiaphas, the high priest, his family was the ones who owned these stalls. And so this corruption reaches all the way up to the high priest himself. The leaders of Israel are complicit in this activity. And so when Jesus is coming in and overturning these tables and turning them over, he is doing this as a specific act of protest against the corruption of the religious leaders of the day. This is not spontaneous anger. This is a planned demonstration, particularly when you realize that one of the major events in intertestamental history for the Jews was when Judas Maccabee took his time in the temple, interpreted the different things, and he ended up taking time to overturn these pagan temples, these pagan money changers. And so Jesus' actions are actually very similar to Judas Maccabee's. Now, Judas Maccabee, when he did that, he actually became quite violent and ended up killing all of these pagans that were worshiping there. And so Jesus is actually a very peaceful form of protest in comparison to that historical occurrence that we might not know about that, but all the Jews of that time would immediately understand Jesus is comparing himself to this Judas Maccabee. He is a different heir of David, just like Judas Maccabee was a royal lineage person. He's a different kind of king. Because after Jesus overturns the temple, we see in Matthew that he begins to heal. He begins to restore the blind and the mute. He begins to teach people the word of God. And so Jesus is very much setting himself up to be a different kind of king. He has entered in peacefully as the son of David. And now, again, compared to Judas Maccabee, he has taken this act of protest to show that his kingdom is different than the nation that these Israelite leaders are building. So all of this is taking place. All of this destruction of property in the temple and this overturning of things. And again, this is clearly not a permanent reform because at some point they're just going to flip the tables back over and go back into it. But Jesus has made a very clear declaration that the current ways of Israel are different than what he has come to inaugurate. So then, it says in verse 19 that when evening came, they would go out of the city. As they were passing by in the morning, so the next morning after they've gone back to Bethany for the night, they're coming back to Jerusalem, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. Being reminded, Peter said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered." All right, so let's put our context thinking caps hat on. Jesus sees the temple. He leaves. He comes to Jerusalem. He withers a fig tree. Goes through this whole big episode of overturning the temple, leaves, and on the way back, they notice the fig tree has withered. So clearly, Mark and in a different way, Matthew are both making the point that this random fig tree miracle is linked to what's happening in the temple. So with that in mind, let's look at an Old Testament connection here. Turn over, if you will, to Jeremiah. And so the prophet Jeremiah is going to talk about the idea, and he's going to make a clear connection with the idea of Israel being a fig tree. Now, that might seem like kind of an odd comparison. Why exactly is it that Israel would be perceived as a fig. But this was actually a really common prophetic image of the idea of Israel, because Israel and Judah were very well known for their figs. In fact, we know that Amos was a tender of figs. That was one of his main jobs, was the idea of, kind of snipping the figs off the tree. And so this was a really common practice, actually. And so we see it actually, Hosea uses this same imagery. Jeremiah is going to use this same imagery. And Amos is going to use this same imagery. And so what we see is that these prophets use the image of Israel as a fig tree. And so what you're going to see in Jeremiah is that Jeremiah talks about the image of God is calling out to Israel, and he's talking to Israel about the people who have been exiled are the good figs. But the people who were left in Israel, who were left in Jerusalem specifically for the destruction, those were the bad figs. And so when Jesus is using this image of the fig tree, he is very clearly calling upon a prophetic idea of Jerusalem, the city being a fig tree. And so what was Jesus' problem with the fig tree? It wasn't bearing fruit. What's his problem with Jerusalem? The temple is not bearing fruit. The temple is supposed to be a house of prayer. It's supposed to be a house of dedication. But it's not that. Instead, it's empty, it's devoid of meaningfulness, and instead has become a den of robbers. And so when Jesus is talking to his disciples, he's trying to make a point here that what you're seeing with this fig tree is symbolic of the problems that are occurring in Jerusalem. I have come to see if it is fruitful, and it has no fruit whatsoever. And so, because of that, this fig tree withers, and so too does that fig tree wither. There's even another cool detail here, because what you see is that Mark records for us, and Mark, likely being a direct source from Peter, sees what Peter says, and Peter says, "Look, the fig tree which you cursed is withered." And Jesus answered to them, saying, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted to him." A lot of times when we talk about that phraseology, we talk about that, if you have enough faith, you can move mountains. And that's kind of a rabbinic idea. But that's not what Mark says. He doesn't say if you have enough faith, you can move mountains. He says if you have faith, you can move this mountain. Well, what mountain is he referring to? Remember how we've talked about how Jerusalem is located upon a mountain? Mount Zion, as it's often called. Mount Moriah in other languages. This mountain that they are referring to as they are walking back up to Jerusalem, Jesus is telling them that if you have faith, you will be able to overcome even this mountain. And if you will but pray it, and if you will but pray for the Lord's will to be done, even this mountain will be cast into the sea. Jerusalem will be thrown over. It will be removed as an obstacle. Now, we know that Jerusalem ended up serving as a great obstacle. The Israelite nation served as a huge obstacle to the early church, because this fruitless fig tree continued to refuse to bear fruit. Now, certainly there were many that did convert to Christianity, that did follow Jesus. But there were also many more who rejected him, who fought violently against him, who persecuted his apostles and his disciples, and attempted to destroy the nascent movement. And so Jesus is telling his disciples, through these actions, through the withering of the fig tree, and through the idea of moving this mountain, that these people who are opposing you, who will continue to oppose you even after my death, by faith you can overcome them, because God has already determined what's going to happen. This fig tree is going to wither. This fig tree shall never bear fruit. It shall continue in its current distress of not bearing fruit. And so what we see is that Jesus is using this kind of odd miracle to make a profound spiritual point. The tree that God had set aside, the tree that God had planted himself and had caused to be his chosen people, had rejected him. It had not borne the fruit that it was supposed to bear. And so it was finally going to be cast out. It was finally going to be withered, and now the wild branch was going to be grafted to the true tree of Israel. Not this unfruitful tree, but the tree that had borne the fruit of faith, the tree of spiritual and faithful Israel. And as all the Gentile nations are grafted in as wild branches, that tree remains fruitful 60 and 100-fold. And so we see in this miracle, odd as it might seem initially, some deep and profound teachings. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this lesson. We hope it has been edifying to you. We hope it has given you some things to think about. Again, it's a parable or a miracle that oftentimes is kind of lost in the translation, gets blown past, but it really is showing the depth of Jesus' teaching, his reliance upon the Old Testament, and really the profundity of what he is speaking about. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will continue over the next couple of days to wrap these things up, to get into the final miracles of Jesus as we prepare to again come to the culmination of the Gospels and the crucifixion and the resurrection. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next time.